What up, Hyperchange? Welcome to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about biotech investing, going over the basics, sort of stocks 101 style. Got a special guest, Aidan here. Aidan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Aidan, before we get into it, I know personally from talking to you, you're super knowledgeable about biotechs, and you have a great knack for making these super complex companies that I personally don't understand at all, like seem super simple, and breaking it down. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show. So maybe you could give everybody a little brief background about who you are, what you do, and why you're interested in the biotech space.
So I work in biotechnology communications consulting for small startups, kind of around their earlier stages of development. And what we really specialize in is helping these companies tell their story to the public, to patients, to investors, so that they can go on to raise money, make an impact, make a difference, and develop therapies that are really going to change the course of humanity and the way we treat diseases forever. So yeah, I find my role as a communicator really important. Science is a complicated field. Healthcare is a very complicated field. And so we have a solemn obligation to make sure people know from across the industry what's going on.
Awesome. And so personally, I don't invest in biotechs, or I haven't. I mean, I've owned a couple stocks here and there, but like it's just such a complicated space. And one of my whole theories is like invest in what you know. Right. So that's why I've stayed away from it. But I'm excited to have you on so we can try and like uncover a little bit of knowledge here. But just from a high level, like I thought it was interesting and related to the hyperchange thesis in that, software is eating the world, specifically software is eating healthcare, like these advances in data science and like computation make it easier to find diseases, maybe conduct R&D, and are probably accelerating the pace of innovation in the space. And so at its core, this is really a field driven by technology. I mean, it's called biotech. So I think it's really relevant to hyperchange. And at a super high level, I think biotechs are really selling time. That's their product, like more time on the planet, maybe more quality of time as you're healthier. And that's something that I think is never going away. And this industry is only going to get bigger and bigger as we go forward. And so there's going to be a ton of really exciting companies built in this space. And that's why I think it's something to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point about time is the only non-renewable asset on the planet. So no matter how much money you make, no matter what your impact is, like you only have so much time. And when people are faced with devastating diseases that affect that clock, there's an important role for healthcare developers and researchers to make a difference. And too many people are dying every year from cancer or heart disease or Alzheimer's, whatever it is. So we need to continue to invest in new therapies, come up with innovative solutions, and modify biology. I mean, we are kind of the masters of our own ship, and I think as we learn more and more about how biology works across, and we get more people's genomes sequenced, as you said, kind of software is eating healthcare in a way, as we get more data on patients and kind of can personalize medicine better, we're going to be able to really start to make a difference, and people are going to have their unique genetic profile. We can get diseases earlier, be more preventative, develop personalized therapies, and ultimately save the healthcare system money in the long run.
So that's a great segue. So maybe really briefly, could you describe what biotechnology is, the word to start?
Yeah, so biotechnology is this idea of that we can control biological process in the body to modulate them to fight against diseases. So what we're doing is we're seeing that when someone develops a type of cancer, there's a biological process that's going in there where the tumor is arising, and we're seeing that happen. And what we're doing is we're studying it, we're seeing how it's unfolding, and we're being like, that's not okay, let's tweak that and tell the immune system to attack that tumor. So we're not doing anything different, we're just using biology as a technology. So we're, as we learn more and more and about how biology works, how our immune system has evolved over thousands and thousands, millions of years of evolution, we're now being able to tweak that just a little bit when diseases arise naturally, and using biology's powers that has been there.
And so could you maybe segue into that, what's the history of the biotech field, and just like a really quick overview of, where it started and where we are today?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about kind of the early kind of healthcare providers and the people who were creating drugs, you have to kind of look around like the World War I, World War II era, where you saw companies like Pfizer or Merck, who were chemical-based companies who developed these chemicals for warfare at the time. And then after these wars ended, they realized, hey, this is an antibacterial, or it can be used as like penicillin to help fight diseases. Or we learned a little bit more about germs. So during that time, like life expectancy was around only 40. And then as we started to use these chemicals to fight against these diseases and make people healthier against just basic kind of flu or various viruses, people started to live longer. And that was kind of the first wave. I mean, we didn't see another big paradigm shifting technology until the 70s. And when the 70s happened, we started to modify E. coli, yeast, biological kind of organisms, and tweak them to affect like growth factor hormones or certain things in the biology. And this was kind of like the first wave of biotechnology, people like to say. But then it was in the 80s and the 90s that there was a next wave in biology where we started to really understand more about tumor subtypes and cancer, and we created like kind of proteins and different molecules that we'd put in the body to kind of modulate things. Now, as of recently, we've created kind of cell therapies is the hot thing, where we're modulating things within inside the cell and tweaking it to fight against various diseases. These companies that are doing this are selling for billions of dollars, are treating things like cancer, helping life expectancy over several years live longer than what they previously were. I mean, these are going to make massive differences in the long run, and this is kind of just getting started. And then looking ahead, we're seeing therapies like gene therapy, which are actually going to modulate things not just at the cellular level, but at the level of the DNA, and alter like the fundamental arising of the disease in the biology. And what this is going to do is change how like kind of cancer or Alzheimer's is fundamentally studied and treated, and it's gonna be paradigm shifting.
Wow. So it sounds like data is sort of an underlying theme of all this, is like the more we know, the more data we have, the sort of more granular we can go, and that gives us more possibilities to like have different therapies and things of that nature.
Yeah, for a long time people were developing these drugs kind of in silos and working on similar things. But as we start to be open, if we start to get more open source about kind of the way we develop drugs, instead of me having to run a clinical trial with my new therapy and test it against placebo, there's already data out there that I can leverage. So it's lowering my costs, and I can leverage other people's trials, other people's data, and help me do my trial faster. And when we start to become more open source and we're leveraging the data better, we can run more specific clinical trials, testing these therapies, and we can leverage what's already been done, which is silly, but it's what hasn't been happening already.
Tying this back to the business model, you mentioned sort of like these companies are worth billions of dollars. And, you know, so as someone who's just like a finance guy, and when I'm reading these filings of, okay, this company, like, let's say for instance, like Juno, one of these like immunotherapy companies, they IPO'd for billions of dollars, yet they have no revenue. You know, they don't have a product in the market. Maybe their drug's in like phase 1 trial. It's still 10 years away from being in the markets. These are super capital intensive businesses, and they're commanding valuations of billions of dollars without even having a product that generates revenue. So, you know, why is that the case? And that seems so fundamental. Like, I think biotech is almost in many ways a very unique business, and that I can't think of another industry where companies get that much valuation based on so little like real product traction. So why is that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of take a step back real quick and to kind of walk through the stages of biotechnology, and just so people kind of have a rough timeline for how a biotechnology goes from being on the petri dish to being approved by the FDA and being kind of given to humans. I mean, I think people don't realize that this timeline is often 10 to 12 years at the minimum, somewhere in the magnitude of $750 to $1 billion, 750 million. So these companies take a long time to develop and test, and there's tremendous risk along the way. I mean, you could be 7 years in, 500 million capital deployed, and there could be a cataclysmic failure where you kill a few patients, and the FDA says you have to not develop the therapy anymore. So I mean, biotech is an incredibly risky field. I mean, these investors that are trying to develop these therapies to make a difference are taking huge capital risks over years and years to just maybe see a potential impact. A trend that we're seeing now is that more and more companies are being able to raise money earlier on. So we're seeing these companies that have yet to even be tested in humans going IPO. And so that's a really interesting trend that's happening.
And so what you were saying about it takes 10 to 12 years to develop this technology and get it to market. So even if you're, 4 or 5 years in, you've probably de-risked like a lot of that technology development. You know, it's still very risky to get that to market, but like the further you get. And so per my understanding, like the FDA process works like this. Like you have Petri dish, you're testing your product, then there's you go into clinical trials, and there's 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Each one of these is sort of looked at as a major catalyst by the market and investors of how far your drug is approved. And like after phase 3, there's the big event of like, is the FDA going to approve it or not?
Right.
If the FDA approves it, then your drug's in market and you can sell it. And then so on the flip, like on one side, it takes so long to get there, billions of dollars, as you say. But once you do get that FDA approval, you know, there's not many, there's maybe probably no one competing in that drug, or like your competition is so artificially limited because it takes so long to get there. So there's this huge barrier to entry for that product. So that's why these companies like Juno are valued so much, because they're, you know, maybe the furthest along in this type of treatment that could eventually be generating billions and billions of dollars, and they'll sort of be untouched in the competition, or that's like the thesis maybe. And so I don't know, maybe you could speak to that of like, you know, what happens at each stage, like, and you mentioned biotech companies are IPOing earlier. So like if, you know, I'm personally seeing companies maybe not even have a phase 1 trial that are already IPOing. They're still 10 years away from generating revenue, yet they're IPOing. And so is that normal? Is that, you know, why do you think that's happening?
Preclinical work before a phase 1 study is just in petri dishes, it's in rats, it's in monkeys. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to see if it works. What we're seeing is these companies who are just doing like high science, really complicated stuff, doing preclinical work in rats and monkeys, and then going out into the public market. This hasn't been tested in humans at all. We have no idea if it works. And going to raise hundreds of millions of dollars on the public market. Mm-hmm. It's available now to everyone, and it's not that de-risked. And so I think as a biotech investor, you have to be very wary of that. Yeah, there's a lot of money pouring into this. People are really excited, and maybe it's a gene therapy company. Maybe they're targeting an ultra-rare disease where no treatment exists. But there's no data yet. And so I think we have to be really wary as investors to make sure kind of what the data is. And like what you're saying is there's a phase 1 study which typically tests for safety. Is this drug killing people? There's a phase 2 study which is trying to figure out what the right dose is to be most effective and efficacious to benefit these patients. And then there's a phase 3 study, which is a large, big kind of study group against the current standard of care maybe, mm-hmm. To really show if there's a big treatment over maybe a long term. And so each at those different stages, as a biotech investor, you might be able to get in earlier on, middle on, or later on, depending on how much risk you want to take. And each one of those events, if they keep going through the loops, the valuation goes up, it's more likely to succeed. And if you get to phase 3 and you have good data, you're going to get an approval, you're going to start to get revenue, there's going to be a real drug on the market. So, I mean, it's a very complicated, long process, but I think it's just important that you, as we're seeing these really exciting companies go public, that you're wary of what their data is going to be and when the data comes out, because that's what the stock is going to shift on, is the data.
And one thing to build on that from just the investor perspective is like what I like to call it is like a hard catalyst. Like these companies, very unlike a business that you'd follow like Tesla or selling software where you can like very like slowly watch it over time. Like the phase 1 data, when that comes out, is like a hard cat. Like that could either send the stock tripling or to like down 50% in one day if it's good or bad or not. So that's kind of a unique scenario. Like the same with phase 2, phase 3, and like especially the FDA approval.
And since biotech kind of works as like a discovery kind of mechanism, like so people are targeting new pathways. So we might not know about a certain pathway in biology, and then people start to go after it. And if there's good data in that pathway and there's other companies who are targeting that same biological pathway and the data is good, their stocks go up too. Like the whole kind of like lake rises.
Yeah, but if rising tide. Like
yeah, totally. But if a company that's leading the way and they're going after this really exciting pathway that everyone's kind of waiting on, and their data comes out and it's like nothing we thought about the way the biology worked is working, all those stocks now tank. So the whole market's kind of like we're just as much as we're developing therapies, we're discovering therapies and how they work and learning more about biology. Wow. So when we learn more, like it's learning more for everyone. And so when we start to see how things are working, it can really send repercussions quickly, either up or down.
And one thing I wanted to build on that is this idea of like why these preclinical companies could IPO, and sort of this idea that like once you develop the IP, and like you were saying, it's very complicated science. Like even if it's still 10 years away from treating one disease, maybe it's also 15 years away from treating 5 other diseases based on that core technology. And so a lot of these companies are valued not only on their leading drug candidate, but it's a technology platform that could affect a lot of diseases. And I think this is true in the biotech space more than almost a lot of others, where that platform technology is true. But the flip side of that is then you have things of like CRISPR. Maybe it is super disruptive, maybe it is this platform technology, but are there 10 companies who are all valued like they're all going to defeat all CRISPR diseases? There's like two sides to that. So I wonder how you think about, these platform technologies.
People are getting really excited about kind of these new frontiers in biology. So one of them recently was RNAi, which is basically taken from the DNA to like DNA gets translated to RNA, RNA makes proteins. Proteins are made up of everything that in your body that helps you function and process things. So basically, if a disease is happening at like the molecular, the biological level of the DNA, of the RNA, we're modulating the RNA interference to make a difference in that. For a while, these companies, like no one wanted to go near there. 15 years ago, like investors were fearful that this was not going to work. Until 2018 in August, the first one got approved. And it's a new platform, it's paradigm shifting, and now everyone else in the RNAi is like, this stuff works. So now they opened up a whole new motif or platform for people to explore RNA technologies.
So why is that so exciting? Like, what disease is that going to cure? Why is that worth billions of dollars in the end market to get investors excited?
What's so exciting about it is it's not just one disease. So they might be going after some rare blood disorder, and they might be altering the RNA interference to stop the increased blood pressure or something like that. But maybe it could work for severe eye infections that cause you to go blind. Maybe it's a DNA transcribing issue, and they're able to interfere with the RNA there. Once you figure out that we can actually mess with RNA, and that's actually having a downstream effect on our biological symptoms, what else could we apply it to? That's when the creativity comes in. It was when we start to learn more that modifying this works. Like, what else could we do it on? And I think that's what gets investors really excited.
And isn't that that the biggest new biotech IPO that's happening? Like, they want to raise like $500 million at like a $7 billion valuation. That's like a similar Moderna Therapeutics?
Yeah.
Is that a similar technology or?
Yeah, Moderna Therapeutics is a company using mRNA technology similar to kind of RNAi. And they are going to have the largest biotech IPO ever. Similar platform, going after 30 different types of diseases, targeting at the genetic level. So, this type of thing that they're doing, mRNA, whether it's DNA editing, whether it's CRISPR, these new gene therapies, like I kind of said at the beginning, this is the new frontier, is altering things at the genetic, cellular level and tweaking them, and you can go after anything kind of downstream of that. The possibilities are really kind of endless here, which is why investors are pouring so much money into. But I'll caveat that by saying that we have to remain focused on the data, that we can't get too excited about the platform. Whether it's exciting that CRISPR can edit DNA at the DNA level and tweak it, or that mRNA can tweak maybe the disease that's kind of caused in the messenger of translating DNA to proteins, which is what mRNA is. But we have to see the data. And this company like Moderna Therapeutics is a preclinical company. So we haven't seen any phase 1 data yet, any readouts.
Wow. And then just to put that in context, like a $7 billion company valuation, not even at phase 1. But if you also go to their page and look at their clinical trials, like they have like 10 or 15 products in their pipeline attacking all sorts of different diseases. So they're getting investors super excited about the potential there, clearly, of the platform, of this technology, and saying, we're not just going to do one disease. We're going to do, and I would argue even the valuation today already prices in the success of one or two of those, probably.
100%.
So I think that's another way to frame, when you think of biotechs, it seems super complicated, but then you can also do this very simple back-of-the-napkin math kind of thing of like, okay, like if this drug gets approved, how many patients, how much can they charge, what's our gross margin, what's the value of that drug? This is $1 billion revenue, value market cap drug.
It's a
blockbuster. But so they're worth $7 billion, and it's going to take them 10 years to get their first $1 billion drug. Like, they need, $20 billion drugs, or like 20 market cap. So you have to think of how many approvals is the market pricing in, and then the story will change over time. If one of their phase 1 trials comes out of a sector where they have 5 different trials going, the data's not looking that good, all of a sudden the market's going to get spooked and could cut half their market cap in one day.
Right.
So, or maybe if the phase 1 data is good, then they're going to be like, wow, it's not going to be 5 things they're attacking that space, it'll be 10. Now we're going to assign it, know. So just really interesting how that trajectory of possibilities can change so quickly.
Yeah, and forget even revenue, right? These companies are so early on. I mean, these companies are, like you said, like yet to even get the earlier stages of data, and investors are taking huge risk. And so, yeah, are they overvalued? Or are they betting on the platform working? Like, only time will kind of tell to see how these things turn out and if they're legit.
And yeah, and so let's talk about a kind of a wave of that recently passed, which was super successful, which was these immunotherapy companies.
Yeah.
Like Juno and Kite Pharmaceuticals, two multi-billion-dollar companies that got bought out by Gilead and Celgene at huge premiums. Gilead and Celgene are these mature biotechs with billions and billions of cash, tons of successful drugs, bulletproof balance sheets. They're saying they're in many ways a perfect partner for Juno and Kite, these sort of risky biotechs who need a ton of capital but have the growth stories that Gilead and Celgene don't have. Yeah. And then the other thing that I thought was just to one little tidbit was Celgene bought like 5 to 10% of Juno at about $90 per share, if I remember correctly, when the stock was trading at 45, a year or two before they totally bought them out. And so I think that's another really interesting pattern I've seen in the biotech space is like these smaller companies or newer companies will start licensing to a much bigger company. And maybe if the tech starts working, like that leads to a rapid buyout. And that's a good like scenario for a lot of these smaller biotechs.
I mean, I think that's a great analysis. I think that's kind of a big theme in the biotech industry is these smaller companies take big risk on kind of these hot gene therapies, CAR T therapy, which is what Kite and Juno did, which is using the patient's own immune system, taking it out of their body, tweaking it, editing it, and putting it back into the person's body.
Yeah, maybe you could explain that a little more, because that's the crazy tech, like what the actually Juno procedure is, and how it's a different way to treat cancer. Because I think that's worth spending like a second on.
Right. I mean, so Juno and Kite, they've pioneered. They were the first two ever approved in the U.S. For this CAR T therapy in 2017, where they showed that they're able to take out the patient's immune system, put it through like a manufacturing process where they
take out cells, right?
Take out cells, yeah. Immune system fighting cells, T cells. CAR T stands for like chimeric antigen receptor T cells.
Okay.
And they take the T cells out, modify them, teach them how to fight the cancer, train them, and then put them back into the body as these like cancer fighting, like supercharging cells. And they go on and just destroy the tumor. So these guys were pioneering in this field. In 2017, they were the first two to receive approval for these different types of cancer. And now there's hundreds of CAR T therapies. So going back to the idea, they opened up the platform for CAR T. It takes a small startup to kind of really pioneer it and do something innovative. And then once they showed the data, they showed it makes a difference, they have billion-dollar buyouts after a phase 3 study. So that's really what you're kind of seeing.
Crazy.
And
And another interesting part of the biotech world is where they're pioneering sort of is this rare disease space, which when we were talking earlier mentioned is sort of a new hot thing. And these are and recently there's a company called Spark Therapeutics that had its first like $1 million treatment approved for this rare eye disease.
Right.
And so this is sort of a new interesting wave in a lot of different angles. Like it brings up ethical questions and all that. Maybe we can get on that in a second, but I'm just curious what you're seeing in this whole like new niche of biotech, the rare disease space.
So Spark Therapeutics was considered the first company, and this was at the end of last year as well, actually, the first company to be doing truly gene therapy. And what they were doing is they took kids that had they were slowly getting blind. Mm-hmm. It's an ultra rare disease. This like only happens in like a handful of children around the United States, around the world every year. And they injected something directly into their eye, a new gene that replicated and gave them their vision back. So imagine a kid who's 11, 12 years old, who's going blind, gets this procedure one time, injection in the eye, disease completely eliminated. So going to your question, how do you price that? Right now they're pricing at $1 million.
Per like one kit.
$500,000 an eye, yeah, roughly.
Wow. But that goes back to our tying theme of like the quality of life and time of life is priceless. So if you have the money, like if you would pay $10 million to do that if you had the money, like it's priceless to be able to see again. And you were also talking earlier about how these genetic diseases, they're more and more finding that when the insurance companies price them, it's like, oh, well, this only happens like 0.001% of the population, so we'll cover you for it. But now on the flip side, the science is finding out there's actually a lot of genetic markers to show a lot earlier on who will have this disease, and we're getting much better every day at understanding who will have that disease and how it will unfold. And so that brings up a whole host of ethical questions. Are insurance companies going to continue to cover these rare diseases in the same way?
So I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these diseases, these rare diseases specifically, have a genetic component to them. So there's something going on in their DNA, some sequence of their DNA in one of their chromosomes that makes them predispositioned to develop a certain disease. So what we're seeing now is like, oh, so if we can alter that DNA in that chromosome, we can help that patient. So there's been this huge flood of investors, of biotech entrepreneurs, of scientists going after these rare diseases. And originally the insurance market, I mean, you look like 10, 15 years ago, nobody was going after rare diseases. There was no revenue model, there was no business model. It didn't make sense to go after something where there's only 1,000 people with disease in the world. But now people are feeling like they can make a real difference, like Spark, and it makes sense to kind of go after and try to eliminate and get rid of these rare diseases. So the flip side of that now is you're seeing all these people with gene therapy spending tons and tons of money, billions of dollars in R&D to develop these therapies. And the insurance companies are like, whoa.
And if you're going to be successful, then you're pricing in that much revenue that we're like, we don't want to cover, kind of.
Now they're covering all these new rare disease drugs. Yeah, of all these new therapies that are costing hundreds of millions of dollars, that they're pricing about $1 million of therapy. I mean, now it's not just one person doing that. It's an influx of biotech companies.
And that brings up an interesting point with the insurance. And that's one thing the couple biotech companies I've tried to invest in, the biggest thing when they're getting a new drug approved is like, okay, now it's approved. How do we get insurance companies to pay for it? Because if insurance companies aren't paying for it, like the market is probably 5 to 10% of what we need it to be. And we needed it to be 100, like, you know? Mm-hmm. And so how does that dynamic work of getting insurance companies to pay for your drugs?
So pricing insurance is an incredibly complicated side of biotechnology. It's something that you're having as you're a drug developer, you're having these conversations before your drug's even approved to figure out what the price is, what they're willing to pay for it, how these insurance companies might even have to change their premiums based on how your therapy's coming in, and you have to kind of have negotiations with each insurance provider on how your drug is. So there isn't just one cost for your drug. You're negotiating with all the different providers based on how meaningful they think the therapy is. The manufacturing, the pricing, sometimes that's like a really complicated aspect. Hence why you see companies like Juno and Kite not stick with it, but just sell out once they get the good data and let a big company deal with the insurance.
Who probably has connections to the insurance companies and good relationships.
Used to the commercial side of the business. Like, I mean, it's a long process of going from the preclinical, the clinical, to the FDA approval, and then there's a whole commercial side of dealing with that. Exactly.
To this thing about expensive treatments, this is sort of, I think, at least I get into arguments people like this about all the time of like, why does that drug cost $1 million? And the way I look at it is like, you know, isn't that only treating a couple people? And I think this is such a thing to understand about innovation is like, we need to be able to fund the companies. Like it costs like what we're saying, 10, 15 years in a petri dish, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, like that's billions of dollars and years of time, all these employees working their ass off to do this.
Right.
And so the money's got to come from somewhere. And if you don't structure the incentive model to where they can charge a lot up front, then like there's no incentive to innovate and we won't get these innovations. And over the long run, I think it's like what Tesla's doing. Like they develop the technology, they sell the super fancy car, they make it a little cheaper, and over the next decade, it eventually gets to where, you know, it can be to the masses. And I think biotechnology is probably the best example of that. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that ethical side of the business where it's not like they only want to treat 10 people, but it's like if they don't, then this would have never been developed and they need to make it cheaper and get it to the mass market. And so, I don't know, do you agree with that assessment? Like to me, that's why the patent system is so important and the IP protection is so important.
I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, that we have to incentivize drug developers to innovate and not just to create a therapy and let that stand alone be out there. So maybe there's regulatory infrastructure that we can put in place to make sure that if you're creating revenue from a drug, that you have to put that back into new therapies and develop and continue to fight for cures and new therapies.
To wrap it up, Aidan, I'm curious, do you have any like sectors of the biotech space that get you super excited, or like companies or technologies that you're like, man, I'm following this closely because I think this is exciting in some way, or I don't know, investors or biotech entrepreneurs or VC firms or anything like that you follow or as a good thought leader, sort of?
Yeah, so what I'm really paying attention to right now is kind of CNS-based companies, so neuroscience kind of based companies. We've started to learn more about the brain. I think just as we were learning about kind of the genetics in the early 2000s with sequencing the genome, we're just starting to deal with the human brain. So I think over the next decade, the next 2 decades, we're really going to start to see some therapies make a difference there. And I think when we start to identify certain diseases that have a genetic linkage to them, that we can say this gene on chromosome 4 is causing you to develop this disease, that people who can target that gene and modulate it and affect it so it's not causing that disease, that's when we're going to start to see solutions. So the more we can learn about these diseases that have a very specific genetic component that we know about, and we can target that and figure out the best way to do it, that's what gets me really excited.
And that would be like gene therapy, sort of.
Gene therapy and indications in diseases that we know about. For example, like we know like certain types of breast cancer have a BRCA mutation, 20% of them, 25% of them. So if you have this mutation on the BRCA mutation, that you have 25% chance of probably getting cancer,
Wow.
of having breast cancer or something like that. So what other things out there can we identify that we can be like, let's target this?
Well, thank you so much for coming on Hyperchange.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned a ton, and like biotech investing is so complicated. Probably this is like I look like a noob compared to like most people who know about the space, but you got to try and learn and fail and ask questions. So
100%.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and I feel like a little bit smarter, and hopefully you come on Hyperchange again.
Heck yeah. This is Biotech Century. I think there's a lot that's going to change. And yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aidan.
Take care.